Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Assessment and Education, What It Means and How to Use It, presented by Dr. Stephanie VanDeventer along with Dr. Ashley Robertson. Thank you so much.
Good morning, I'm Dr. VanDeventer, and I'll take a moment to introduce myself and then let my colleague, Dr. Robertson, introduce herself. You may have come to some of our other seminars. I'm previously with the University of South Florida. I'm now with Keiser University. I've been there about 8 years. I've been in the field of education for the last 35 years and have worked heavily in the area of instructional design. I've also worked with assessment, as most of us do in education, and today's session is going to talk a lot about what assessment means. And some of you that are teachers may know this, and those of you that are parents, we're hoping to give you a little more information about that. So at this point, let Dr. Robertson introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us this morning. I am Dr. Robertson. I also am a professor at Keiser University in the education department. I am the program coordinator for our PhD programs, as well as a dissertation chair for our dissertation students. And I do actually lead the assessment process for our education department. So I am, I guess, elbow deep in assessment and different ways that we assess our program and our students at the higher education level. So very excited to be here this morning to talk about this topic with you.
Dr. Robertson is an absolute expert in assessment. So she will be talking a lot about some of the areas. We're going to discuss areas of assessment that are both formative and summative, and she will be jumping in to add some examples along the way. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about what assessment really means. It's kind of a catch-all term, and it has some understandings in the real world that are a little bit different in the field of education. And we're going to talk about how it's used and how to use it in the field of education and what this means for you and for your child. Our agenda today is going to cover first what assessment is, and then we're going to talk about the difference between these two terms that really seem to cross over a lot, assessment and evaluation, but they're really different. They are used interchangeably out in life, but they don't mean the same thing. We'll cover some different types of assessment because even though we often think there's only one, multiple choice tests, there are many, many ways in which we assess people. We'll talk a little bit about anxiety and test taking, what it means to practice, the idea of remediation, which we talked a little bit about last week, or actually quite a bit in our curriculum seminar. And we'll talk about two concepts that I think are very interesting, and we'll discuss how you know what you know and how you know what you don't know. And these are two things that are both involved in the ideas of assessing ourselves. Last week, we talked about curriculum extensively, and we went through interacting, practicing, and deepening. And we wanted to go through a little bit real briefly here about deepening just a wee bit more because it relates extensively to assessment. When we are first teaching someone something, we're interacting with them. The learner is interacting with the content. They're getting to know new information. That's one of the stages of learning. The next step involves practice and getting feedback. So after they've had some instruction from their teacher, they practice what they've learned, and the teacher gives them feedback, which typically is what we call formative assessment, meaning it's forming what they learn. So we're giving some sort of a small assessment of how they've done along the way, and then which might just be asking questions or watching them, and then helping to form what they know by giving some assessment on that. Ultimately, we get to what we call deepening of instruction and deepening of learning, where we have more interaction with learning. We apply things more. The students engage deeply in practice. They extend their critical thinking. And this often, at the end of this deepening process, we have what's called a summative assessment. And that's what we all think of as assessment in the world today, is that sort of exam that we have that asks whether we learned something. And in our society, it's become very common for that exam to be a multiple choice standardized test. but we're going to talk today about what else exists as a test. Excuse me. I'm very congested. I apologize for my voice. So let's say, what is assessment really? We're going to talk about the difference between assessment and evaluation. And assessment is figuring out whether the learner has gained the knowledge or the ability to do something, the information that you were trying to teach them. Usually you have a set of objectives and that you're going through teaching them what you expect them to know, and you're assessing whether or not they did it. And you usually are looking at their performance in some way. And that might be a test. It could be something written down. It could be an oral examination where you ask them some questions. That test might be multiple choice. We're very familiar with that. Could be short answers, could be an essay. A lot of other countries don't use multiple choice. They pretty much use essay only or oral testing. It might be something that we call authentic assessment, which is where they do a project or they present something, maybe give a reading, demonstrate their proficiency. All of these things are what we mean when we say we're assessing the learners. We want to see if they actually acquired the skills or the understanding of what we taught them. And that's what assessment is. On the other hand,
jump in there quick, Dr. VanDeventer, before we move forward to evaluation versus assessment, I just want to kind of make a connection right now to, things that are going on in society, and a lot of our students who are experiencing a mode of learning that may look a little bit different, and teachers that are experiencing a mode of learning that may look a little different, where some of their students are going to school online, some days, some are, in person, in class. So teachers right now, I think probably one of the biggest challenges that they have is this idea of assessment. And when we are assessing students online, I mean, there are definitely options for multiple choice questions, things like lockdown browsers to make sure it's the students who are, taking the test, who are supposed to be taking the test. Pearson has become an expert in this, as all of us know as teachers. We've sat for those teacher certification exams and FELI exams, and you all sit in a room and answer multiple choice questions. But I think as parents and as teachers, what you're going to start to see is a lot more of those authentic performance assessments being a better indication of where and how our students are learning, especially when they're practicing and doing a lot more on their own online. I think personally we're going to see a shift from that multiple choice to more development and performance in those authentic assessments. So I think probably a lot of our attention will be focused on that today, and how to truly understand learning from more of those authentic assessments.
Thank you, Dr. Robertson. You're so right. And I think we're seeing a switch in society, and we'll talk in a minute about what we've been seeing over the last 100 years, really, with assessment and how we're moving out of that. We're just in the cusp of switching over, and it makes so much more sense the way we're beginning to assess now. It goes back to the way we used to assess. So now we know that when we assess, we're trying to see if someone learned and if they gained a skill. But what is evaluation? Because those two terms are used interchangeably. Evaluation in the field of education is really different. It means when we put a meaning to the results of the assessment. Okay, so someone has learned this, but how do we gauge that? And so it might be a pass or a fail test. When I was taking my doctorate exam, I had to take a language examination, and it was, you either did it or you didn't. There was one measure, there was a bar I had to meet, and if I couldn't meet that bar, then it was not considered a pass. It was not considered a pass. It was a fail. I actually took the test twice, because the first time I was 1 point away from passing, and there was no acceptance of it. I had to take it again to get beyond that. So in the informal schooling, we often see grades, which is the A, B, C, D, E, F. That's what we're very familiar with. But out in the real world, we also see sort of certificates when someone finishes something. We might see, for instance, your driver's license. That's a evaluation of an assessment. You were assessed for whether or not you could successfully drive. You took a test, a driving test, you took a written test, and the certificate that you get is your driver's license. So these are the kind of things that we see that demonstrate that we have successfully acquired some level of learning, some proficiency at doing something. And that's what evaluation is. It's that measure and showing us whether we can do it. So where did this whole idea of assessing people come from? Well, first of all, just keep in mind that we have always assessed. It was just usually done very differently. One of the earliest types of assessment was when people took a test to become a scribe in ancient Egypt. They had to do an authentic assessment. They had to write something. They had to read something written. So if you couldn't read some paper that was written or document or etched in stone, if you couldn't read it or you couldn't write something that someone read out loud to you, then you couldn't pass the exam. And there might have been ways in which it was done that were even more specific, such as an amount of time or quality of it being done, and to a certain degree of how it looked, because hieroglyphics were used heavily back then. So what did it look like when it was written in the actual language? We also saw very frequently in our country before the advent of the automobile, tests to become, for instance, a blacksmith. And you would have to do something. The person might have to shoe a horse or make a sword or create a hinge. Interestingly, in this case, there was, and similarly to becoming a scribe, your success out in the world, there'd be a feeling of evaluation that was constant, because you would progress along your field and you would do better or worse. If you were not becoming more proficient and learning to become an expert, you probably would not be someone that would be used very much. If you were a blacksmith who perhaps made it through your apprenticeship and you were no longer a novice and now you were considered to be a functioning blacksmith in society, but you didn't do very well, people wouldn't come to you, they wouldn't use you. So your evaluation might be that your master or your expert teacher taught you what was necessary, but you might have only been to a certain level of proficiency that wasn't really great. But typically you had to meet some level of proficiency saying that I can do this out in the world. We also saw
of apprenticeship too.
Right.
That is the idea of formative assessment, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But when you are learning with an apprentice, they are giving you feedback and teaching you along the way, and you're practicing and you're doing the little skills before you become a blacksmith or whatever it is you're becoming on your own. So that person technically stands as a teacher, and everything they teach you and make you do along the way are assessments that build up to, you know, that main skill when you can go out on your own and be successful.
Thank you. Yeah, that's correct. In fact, in our own country, in the early part of the last century, from around maybe the 1800s to about 1950, there were not, right now when someone gets a doctoral degree, you pass through a committee and you do a dissertation. Earlier in our time period, there was one professor who was your major professor, and they would determine whether or not you were ready and you could become a doctor. So you were not, if you didn't satisfy that person's measure, their subjective determination of whether you were ready as a master, they would not let you through. So you could go on for 20 years and they wouldn't let you become a PhD. So then we began developing different methods because it seemed a little unfair. Pardon me. Then we also saw situations with guilds where people had to demonstrate their abilities within a certain proficiency range. For instance, to become a painter, to become a part of a guild, you had to have a set of skills and demonstrate that to the guild. Then you could become a member of the guild and you could practice within that city. This was the case with Rembrandt, Renoir, many famous painters during their time period. When Dr. Robertson mentioned apprenticeship a minute ago, the way people learned to become a medical doctor until recently was almost entirely by watching someone else. In our time period of the growth of medicine, from Hippocrates all the way forward until probably the 1800s, there were not objective tests. There was no sort of assessment that wasn't done as an apprentice. The other doctor, or groups of doctors would give you little tasks, clean these rags, carry this severed limb to the garbage, whatever it might be. You did all the things that you were told to do, and you ultimately learned. They'd give you a task one day. Okay, I want you to sew this, or I want you to clean this wound. And you would slowly learn how to do things, measure this medication out. And as they saw that you succeeded, then they would move you on. So that you had mentors, and then you began to take on the role of mentor. It was really interesting how people became a doctor learning how to do that. Then one day, there was just a tipping point where you became the doctor, and it was just assumed that you knew. You had to, in your own mind, know that you knew, and the others might say, yes, you knew well enough. As time went on, we began having tests, we began having colleges, we began having ways in which it was done that was more formal to determine that someone from a social standpoint had passed these proficiencies. That's how assessment began to grow. It was the same. This is how it's always been with teachers, a surveyor, a carpenter, anyone in any field. Long ago, it was just done by watching an expert, working with an expert, and then becoming the expert. And now we have more tests. So when did we start to change our perceptions of assessment? And why did this happen? It started happening in the 19th century along with the factory mentality, because when measurement started to be studied more and people began looking at setting up the factory assembly line and so forth, they began seeing how they could apply that to other things, including education. And in the mid 1900s, education was really beginning to be approached as a scientific endeavor. And they began trying to measure how much people knew. And it was becoming a matter of, let's see if these students are competent. How does this relate to the school? How does this relate to different groups of students? And that's where we started to see more of this standardized testing. Today, unfortunately, standardized testing and measurement of learning sometimes has more value than actual learning. If you're a teacher, you can probably attest to that. And if you're a parent, you might feel frustrated by that as well, that so much is put on the test. So we are trying to move away from that and not have those tests take precedence over actual learning. We really want to know if someone learned, not how well they did on a test. That's the most important thing. So that's the kind of the place where we're moving to.
All right. Great background and great history. And I think this is kind of the heart of where the change, I guess, needs to occur. And unfortunately, it's probably not going to happen quickly in terms of, the Board of Education and the government and the federal government, the state governments. There is such a press on accountability, and the way that they measure accountability, unfortunately, is through those standardized multiple choice exams. So what we kind of want to focus on today is how we can help our students and our teachers reverse their way of thinking so that maybe they look at those final summative assessments or standardized assessments a little bit different and not as, stressfully. How we can focus more on what is happening before they get to that point, so that when that test comes, they feel more prepared for it without having to, do so much extra to just prepare for it. So we want to see that movement towards differentiation and a shift in attitudes by increasing student responsibility. And the way that we do that is to change our students from feeling so dependent upon the teacher to being able to use formative assessments, being able to self-monitor, being able to use what they learn in lessons and the feedback that they're getting, and to improve and self-monitor and self-track on their way to learning, from that idea of being a novice to an expert in what it is that they're learning.
I want to add to that one of the reasons that we see this movement toward differentiation as a sign that there might be a change in attitude is because for those of you that are not teachers, differentiation is a new trend in the field where we are teaching our students in different ways. So instead of just doing a lecture and doing a presentation, when a teacher can go into the classroom and teach in other ways, for instance, have the students do something authentic, or have students work in groups, because if lecture tends to focus on people who are either good at hearing and taking information in orally, or who are good at writing. So we need to think about how students might learn in other ways. Some students need to move around to learn. Some students need to explore something to learn. So when teachers are helping students to differentiate, and it can by teaching in different ways, it can help those students to learn. And we're now seeing a greater shift on whether or not the student has learned in a way that's comfortable for them. And that's leaning toward changes in understanding our own learning, which is leaning toward changes in assessment. As Dr. Robertson said, this is a long, slow path. It was a long, slow path getting to this point of assessment that we've been in for the last 100 years, and it's going to be slow getting us out of it. But we definitely see the signs that we're getting there.
Yeah, and it's a challenge right now because teachers are moving toward that differentiation. They want to teach in different ways, but it's a hard path to understand how to connect. You know, here's how I'm teaching, here's what the students are practicing, but it doesn't look the same when they sit down for that standardized test. So they may truly understand and can do what they're supposed to have done, but when they read that question on the test, it just doesn't click. So we are at that crossroads, and being able to combine the idea of, you know, getting students more involved in learning in the way that they need to, but also giving them that practice in how that learning may look and read, or there may be questions that are asked in different ways, is truly what an expert is able to do. Anybody can repeat. I have a 2-year-old, and we read some of the same books over and over. So when I ask him, where's the horse, he can point to it. Does he know exactly what a horse is? And can he see it out in the real world and say, oh, that's a horse? Maybe not yet. But as he develops that expertise, when he sees it elsewhere or he hears it elsewhere, he'll be able to make those connections and say, oh, it's not just in the book. It's also, here's where I did it, here's where I saw it, here's where I heard it. Right, let's move forward to the next one, and to kind of, I guess, delve into that idea a little bit deeper. And this is something that we can talk to about our students or our children. You know, think about when you've learned something on your own. Your child is not the only one learning and being tested. And unfortunately, many of our children develop anxiety about assessments. So if we look at this in a different perspective, we might be able to understand and help our children also look at assessment as a learning process, as opposed to an end-all be-all. So think about a time when you learned to cook a new recipe, or you were learning a language, you needed to build that IKEA desk that we talked about, you're setting up a new TV, you're hanging it on the wall. Think about the ways you don't have a teacher there unless all you do is hire the Geek Squad from Best Buy. But think about all the ways that you figure out how to do something right now as an adult. We may look up instructions and read about it online, or we may watch a YouTube video. We maybe ask that Geek Squad for advice, or like I was doing the other day, I'm going to instant chat Samsung and make sure that I order the right speakers that are going to hook up to my TV without an issue. So I go to that expert for advice. Once we get the background information that we need, we start doing it, right? We practice, we may mess up, we may say, hey, I did something wrong here. We go back to those instructions or go on that help chat again. We maybe check off the things that we're accomplishing or getting done as we go along the way. So let's say when you're cooking a new dish for Thanksgiving and you're looking at that recipe and you're saying, yep, I did this, I did this, I did this. Now I go to this and this. All of that is an example of learning. It's self-monitoring. And that is exactly how our children learn and what they're doing in the classroom or online or in front of the computer. They're learning something and interacting. They're practicing getting feedback. And typically with that practice, in order to get feedback, they have to be doing something. And that's that idea of formative assessment. They're doing something that they can get feedback on so that they then can improve and change and go down that right path. And then at the end, think about when you know you've accomplished it. You take that new dish out of the oven and you taste it, and it's either going to go in the trash or it's going to go on the Thanksgiving table. So you know when you've gotten it. You know when you set up that new IKEA desk and it doesn't fall over or the drawers aren't on backwards, that you have followed all the steps and you have successfully learned it. And that idea is that summative assessment. You've built it all up, you've done it at the end, and you've been successful. Right now, as Dr. VanDeventer said, our society and education really focuses on that idea of standardized tests as that final assessment. So if we can get our minds away from that test being the standalone and instead focus on that test being the last step in that learning process, we can hopefully begin to change our attitudes, decrease some of that anxiety that our children or our parents may have as we're approaching that test, and starting to look at assessment in a different way.
Let me add also that one of the keys, when anyone moves from becoming a novice to an expert, there are 7 things they have in common, novices and experts. Well, one of the things that you have to do is to self-monitor. You learn eventually how to self-monitor, and you do that by stopping along the way and asking yourself, how am I doing? Did I understand that? And you do that when you're cooking, when you're using a table saw. Believe me, you're going to stop, you're going to check that blade, you're going to make sure that you're not making a mistake because you don't want to hurt yourself. So as you naturally self-monitor along the path to becoming good at something, and that's one thing we need to teach our children how to do, is to stop, ask themselves how they're doing. Do they understand it? And do they think that they need more help, or can they move on? This self-monitoring is the absolute key to actual learning and to becoming an expert instead of a novice. Go ahead, Dr. Robertson. I'm sorry.
Sure, not a problem. We talked a little bit about this already, so I'm not going to belabor this too much, but there are many types of assessments, many ways to assess. Our students have probably experienced all of these. We have our, in-class, standardized, paper, pencil. We have computer-based tests that may look more like problem solving or simulations. We have mobile devices where maybe we do quick checks like polls, which you all experienced in the beginning of this presentation as just kind of a quick check. Presentations and portfolios, our students have definitely experienced that, all the way up through authentic assessments where maybe it's a longer term project like a science board project, or they're doing a lab in science, or some sort of poster presentation.
CPR, performing CPR.
Sure, performing CPR, any of those authentic kind of getting up and doing it and seeing how they're accomplishing what they've learned. So there's tons of different ways to assess and to do this. They're all valid. They're all appropriate in certain situations. So I think it's a matter of making sure in terms of curriculum that the type of assessment that you're using aligns to what they have learned along the way, and maybe builds up to small bits of practice towards what they'll see on a standardized test. So, maybe a presentation or authentic assessment is appropriate for the lesson that they're learning, but within that assessment or within that lesson, maybe giving them practice towards different ways that that content can be asked or approached, or questions may be asked about it, so they see it in a lot of different formats, is a best way, again, to both prepare and remove some of that anxiety. So go ahead to the next one.
Okay, I just wanted to add, not only that, but this is what they do in the real world. When our students are out there working in their professions, they're doing presentations and portfolios and authentic assessments. They're very rarely taking a paper and pencil test. So that might be to get them into a position, but you typically are not doing that later.
Right, absolutely. And all of this is about the idea of practice, right? Like we're talking about, it can take from 2,000 to 10,000 hours to become an expert. And any discussion that we have about expertise, I'm going to default to Dr. VanDeventer, because I think that is what her dissertation was on. She is an expert at developing expertise. But we do not expect our students to become experts at everything. Expertise is something that eventually that child narrows down to become or to do throughout their life. It may become their lifelong work. So keep that in mind as you teach or as you help your child. It's just the basics that you need to learn. You don't need to be an expert in this, and tailoring that education and that practice so that we get to the level that they have to demonstrate. It is really, again, a way to remove some of that anxiety, to allow children to practice, to prepare them for the basics that they need to know in order to produce on an assessment. And then if it's something that's important to them, hopefully their curriculum, their practice, their internships, apprenticeships, their jobs will continue to help build that idea of expertise and practice toward that skill. Right. So this is where formative assessments come in. Formative assessments are assessments that teachers use while they're teaching. And it not only informs the teacher on how the students are doing as they build up to that content or skills, and where they may need to step in and remediate, but it also can check for readiness. So if you are doing formative assessments, and as a teacher, the majority of your children are not doing well in these assessments, why would you give them a summative assessment? If they're not doing well on the formative ones, they're not ready. So it will inform that readiness. It can check engagement. And this is a big thing with our students going to school online right now. If you have those quick pulse checks, for example, last week, we showed you guys an example of Play Pause It, which is a way to show a video and to stop during a video, ask a question, and get immediate feedback from the students. So if you notice that the students are all turning on this video and nobody's answering the questions, they may not be engaged. That may be a sign that there's a different strategy that's needed to engage them. And that's really the role of a teacher. Is it that the children are not learning, they don't understand this, or they're just not paying attention? And we need to approach in a different way. So the key during formative assessment is that it provides the opportunity to look for places to help students build that foundation, build that understanding, overcome misconceptions, so that they are prepared for those bigger assessments later. Formative assessments can include questions, maybe pre-tests to find out what they know before you teach something, minute quizzes or pulse checks, like I like to call them. When I was teaching, I would do a quick, thumbs up. I'd ask a question, thumbs up, thumbs down. It could be an exit ticket So when you finish teaching a lesson, or the students finish learning something, you have them, write down a question they have, or something that they were confused about, or something that they learned, and provide that as a way for the child to self-monitor as well. They could be observations. So if the students are practicing in a group and the teacher is just wandering around taking notes and listening to what the students are saying and writing down maybe words or things that he or she hears that could be misconceptions, and then they bring everybody back together and reteach. And then all of those elements of practice. So when your child is given a worksheet or a little written test, or a list of math problems that they're working on, all of that is a means of giving the teacher an opportunity to see where the students are struggling, so that they can reteach before that more summative or authentic assessment or standardized assessment.
And I think it's important to keep in mind that the students need to understand, try to take away the fear of the testing for them, so that they realize that it's not for a grade, that the teacher's job is to find out what they know and to help them learn. So often I think the students are fearful. When you say quiz, it's terrifying. So at least it was for me when I was in school, and it doesn't need to be that way.
Right. That's hitting home and focusing in on that idea that we're learning from our mistakes. And that's what remediation means. It's learning where we made a mistake, understanding why we made that mistake, and then correcting it and practicing it correctly. And I think we said this in one of our last presentations, but if a child is not getting that feedback during this remediation stage, and they keep practicing something incorrectly and incorrectly and incorrectly, remember, moving from novice to expert takes, we said 2,000 to 10,000 hours of practice. But if those hours are practicing wrong, we are not getting anywhere on that continuum. So it is so important to use these formative assessments in order to fix and remediate, not just to provide grades in a grade book to move students along, but to actually stop, reteach. And this is a great opportunity where parents can jump in too. So if your child is doing poorly on little quizzes that they're taking, or spelling tests that they're taking, or you're going through flashcards with them and they're getting things incorrect, it's a great opportunity to not just keep moving forward and keep practicing, but to remediate, to understand why they may have made that mistake, to talk about it, to get that child to monitor themselves a little, and then to try again. And once they get it correct, then at that point, we practice and we practice and we practice.
And to help them understand that when they fail and that remediation occurs, that there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, like we say here on the screen, we learn best when we make mistakes. That is absolutely the case. If you get something right the first time out, you may not understand the process. You might not know why that happened. It may have been a total accident. But if you get it wrong, if you make a mistake, it actually can be helpful to you, because you're going to go back and find out where that mistake occurred, or the teacher's going to help you. So you stop, you think about the process, and you really understand it better by getting that remediation.
Right. And keep in mind with our students, they are novices, so they don't know how to do that yet. They need to be taught, and they need to learn how to go back and check for mistakes and how to take that path backwards. And training their brain to do that is also training their brain to become more critical thinkers, so that they can look through situations and see, if I do this, this, and this likely will occur. And that's not, just important for what they're learning in school, but for life as well. We want our children, when they're out playing with friends or, hanging out with their buddies, before they make a poor decision, to be able to think through and say, if I do this, this, and this likely will happen. And that starts in school, training them to really think through where mistakes may have occurred, to think backwards about what we learned and what I was supposed to do, and to self-monitor and self-regulate that way. So some common ways to help with this, to remediate in a classroom or as a parent from home, is to give them feedback and to allow them to try something again. And I'm not going to read these examples, but we have some examples of what this may sound like if you were to do that. It could be reteaching using a new method. So if you give them feedback and they revise and they're still getting it wrong, it may be time to come back in and say, hey, maybe that video wasn't great in how to teach this. So I'm going to develop a little chat, and I'm going to have everybody come together, and I'm going to lecture and provide questions. And maybe I'll reteach this in a different way, or I'm going to give them a simulation where they go through it themselves and see if maybe they learn it that way. And then another option to remediate may be small group instruction. So you may find that there's only a few students that are still really struggling. The rest got it. So instead of remediating everybody and providing instruction over and over and over again, maybe we grab that small group, do a little meetup while everybody else is practicing, and we provide some direct instruction and talk directly to the students, and maybe ask them questions and have them respond directly. So just some different options if students still seem to struggle and not get it from there. Okay. One of the essential pieces, again, is to teach the kids how to look for errors, how to understand their own mistakes. And again, that's through self-monitoring. So walking them through how to go back over the path to correct it. So having them say, oh, here's where the mistake was made, here's what I should have done. Scaffolding for them, being there as they're making that mistake, allowing them to make the mistake, and then helping them figure out where it was made and why. It is going to give them more of that motivation and confidence to not give up, which again develops that critical thinking and gets the child more on that path from novice to expert.
One of the things we know is that experts self-monitor constantly. They're not even aware of it. They've gotten so good at it that they constantly self-monitor. Their brain is working in two forks. One is solving the problem that's placed in front of them, and the other one is checking to make sure that they're doing it right. And when they make a mistake, they fix it right there during the solution, so that when they get to the end, they have the right answer. It's done properly. A novice, on the other hand, has less information to work with and is typically unable to see the whole picture. They haven't done it enough times to understand the process. And so very frequently when they make a mistake along the way, number one, they're not self-monitoring. They're not looking to see if they made a mistake. And even if they are, they might not recognize their mistake. When they get to the end, they may have it wrong. So they have to then go back and check and see where that occurred. This happens to us all the time. I told the story before about building the desk and in the IKEA furniture and the front panel of it, which was the second thing that went on the desk. I put it on backwards. And when I got through with the entire desk, it was wrong. So I had to turn around, take everything apart and do it again. And I have never, ever, ever made that mistake again. And I always self-monitor very carefully when I put something together, which I avoid at all costs. But it's arduous. Some students find it frustrating, but it's natural. And that's one of the things we have to explain to them. This is how we all learn, is by practicing these things and doing them over again and making mistakes and then fixing it. No one gets better without doing that. And the expert surgeon has, the best surgeon would be the one who has performed that surgery hundreds, if not thousands of times. If you could go to an expert surgeon to have your gallbladder removed, who had done that gallbladder surgery with a team, let's say 1,000 times, or you could go to the foremost gallbladder expert in the world who had written 5 textbooks about it, but he'd only done 15 surgeries, which one would you pick? You should always pick the person who's done it the most, because they've seen the most instances of things that can go wrong. They've solved those in the moment, and they're going to do a better job. Even if they the other person may have created the device that removes the gallbladder. It doesn't matter. It's going to be the person who has the most practice. It's going to have the most overall general knowledge of something and be able to do it the best. So both people are important, but you want someone that's done it a lot. Same thing about the plumber that comes to fix your toilet. The guy that read the book is not going to be as good as the guy that's done 20 toilets. So this is the way our students need to learn a little more about that. When we think about, we've talked a lot about formative assessment, which is how we learn and how we remediate and how we get better. And then ultimately we get to this point where we are going to have some sort of a summative assessment. And this is what we, as Dr. Robertson said, we need to think of this as only a part of the process of learning and of the part of assessment instead of the weight that it presently holds today. It holds way too much value and weight on the idea of whether a student is capable. They should be used at the very end after we feel confident that the student has learned. And you want to measure their understanding of that content and see if they've reached a certain level to move forward. But again, it gives some information about the need for more instruction. It gives primarily information about the ability to move forward. Can they go to the next topic? Can they move to a new grade level? Can they get that driver's certificate and that license? And hopefully summative assessment is going to give you some assurance that the student has been able to achieve understanding of that content and use it for transfer, and that they can use it in the real world or on a future standardized test. Unfortunately, with standardized testing, as Dr. Robertson mentioned earlier, a lot of the test items don't necessarily test properly what was actually learned in the classroom. So there seems to be a break between what the students are doing and how they're being tested. And this is what we're starting to see some changes on. So sometimes transfer doesn't occur very well because the test is not designed well to test what was taught. So ultimately, when you see that assessment, that summative assessment, it tells you what the student's capabilities or understanding or competence was at that moment in time. And you have some idea of what they understand in general about a topic. If you go to take the driver's test and you are able to pass it, then we can feel confident that you're able to operate on the roads. If you don't pass it, probably it was not a matter of nervousness, but that you really were not capable of doing that in a real situation. So you need to have more practice. When we see questions on a test, standardized test, it might be written, it could be multiple choice, short answer, those kind of things. That's the most common. We often have post tests. Dr. Robertson mentioned, I believe earlier, a pre-test to see where students are starting. And then we often give them a post test at the end to see what they learned. That's very useful. And sometimes a post test doesn't necessarily have to be a summative, but it's just giving us an idea that we might help more with formative assessment, but it can also be used for summative. With performance is another way that we determine whether a student has learned. We watch them do something, they demonstrate, can they perform, can they do it to a certain level. In education, we often use what are called rubrics, where we're looking for certain characteristics that the student is demonstrating their ability to do, whether it's writing a paper or reading something or giving a presentation, or, as I said a minute ago, performing CPR. The teacher or the mentor is looking to see if they're meeting these elements of a rubric, and that helps to determine their ability to say that, yes, they've achieved this level of learning, and that's the summative assessment. And it might be demonstration of their knowledge in critical thinking or their ability to create something. These are also ways that we summatively assess, but they're much more subjective. We try to break those down as well onto some sorts of rubrics to look at their ability to write creatively or to develop a play or to deliver something, their ability to draw. There can be certain elements that are broken down in the whole process of drawing, and are those present in the ultimate project the student delivers. So those are also some things that, even with creative and critical thinking, that we can demonstrate in a summative assessment. Students tend to get very nervous during summative assessments because they feel like the ultimate answer is going to hold the key to their future, and in many cases it does hold the key to whether or not they move forward. But we have to understand that this is important to do well on this in order to move forward. And if you aren't able to meet that grade, then you want to go back and be sure that you learn it before you move forward. What's the point of saying, I'm able to be a good driver, I've got this license, if in fact you don't know how to drive and you can't operate out in the world? That's dangerous for everyone, including you. So we really want to be sure that we master that. How are we using assessment today to enhance our learning? This is another area we want to talk about that goes beyond formative and summative assessment, because we really are needing to move into that idea of our students really learning. And we've used this term before, to inform the teacher and the learner of progress. One of the changes that's taken place in the idea of assessment in these last few years is the idea that the learner has responsibility for their learning and need to be aware of whether they've learned. And they're not passive, that they're simply not a vessel that we're pouring information in and then they're spitting out something, but they need to be conscious of whether they are actually learning. And typically, as we said before, you know whether you've learned something. We need to use assessment to show growth and to help students grow, and not so much to punish them or judge them for something, and to let them know that that's what it's all about. It's about achieving and growing, and it's not meant to judge you in a negative sense. It may judge you to see if you've learned, but it's not designed to remove the capacity for you to move forward. You will eventually get there. We also want to be able to target their understanding and help them move forward. And ultimately, we want to help students take charge of their own learning, to be an involved participant and to be responsible for their learning. One of the things we can ask ourselves along the way, sort of like self-monitoring, is how do you know what you don't know? This is an interesting thought, because there's a 4-scale construct about the levels of competence, and one of them is called the unconscious incompetent, meaning you don't know what you don't know. And the conscious competent is the person who does know what they do know. How do you move from that? You can also be an unconscious competent, which is you don't know what you do know. And you could be a conscious incompetent, which is you do know what you don't know. So how do you understand what you don't know? And it's a matter of reflection and self-monitoring and being engaged and understanding in your learning. So it really boils down to that self-monitoring and what you can do as a parent to figure out whether you don't know something. And understanding that you don't know it is, you can ask your child, do they need help? If they say they need help, that means they probably don't know it. You can ask them to stop, take a breath, relax for a minute, think about how to solve that problem, instead of just racing to the end and trying to get through with it or feeling frustrated and giving up. Go back on the path. So self-monitor, where did the problem happen? And let's think about what it might be and find that mistake, talk about it, fix it, and then move forward. We do this all the time in everything that we do in our adult lives, and we can do it more with our kids. So when we talked about building that deck or learning how to use that table saw or hang that TV, it's exactly what we do. We can teach students how to do the same thing. Slow down. When you're solving a problem, slow down. You'll figure out whether you know something or you don't know something. You'll see where you have issues along the way. Stop and ask yourself every now and then, do I think I'm getting this? Does this make sense to me? Consider what your results are. If you think you've made a mistake, then fix it, move on, or it's not listed here, but ask for help. So you have an internal sense of when you don't know something. And there's probably times in all of our lives, I'm sure those of you that are listening, you've been in a situation where you feel a little bit like an imposter, or you might be on the spot and you have to do something and you're terrified because you really don't think you're capable. And maybe you do it anyway and you sort of get through it, but it might not have been your best performance. You knew what you didn't know. And you were probably in the practicing situation, but you had to perform. So our students are the same. They pretty much know what they don't know. And they have a sense that there's more to this, that they haven't grasped it yet. And the next question is, how do you know what you do know? When do you have a sense that you've understood something, that you're that conscious competent? Well, again, as a parent, you can ask them how they're doing. And they're going to say that they think they're doing really well, or they're going to say they're confused. Um, the great question is to ask, do you think you're learning? Do you understand this? Do you feel confused about anything? And then ask them if they think they're ready to move on. If they think they're ready to move on, they're willing to say it, because they're not going to want to jump into new material typically unless they feel like they've mastered what they've been working on. Again, what you can do as a student is, and what you can help your children to do, is to slow down and ask them if they understand what they're learning. It's important to think about what you're learning and whether or not you understand it, or if you're just memorizing it, if you're learning something by rote. Sometimes we have to remember facts and we have to learn knowledge, but it's always part of a process. We're learning that knowledge because we're going to use it somewhere else. So try not to just memorize something, but do I really understand it? A lot of times when we're learning a language, we're learning our vocabulary, and that's great. But do we know how to use that vocabulary in sentences as we move forward? And do we understand the right place to do that? That's how we begin to understand whether we know the language. Do we hear it and can we understand it? And next, can we produce it? Can we now create a sentence in our mind and then say it out loud? So you sort of get a sense whether you know, do you think you've learned the material? If you think you've learned it, then try moving forward. I strongly believe that, and I think if all of you think about it, when you understand something, you know it. You generally have a sense that you know it. And then if you try it out in the world and you happen to be wrong, well, that happens to us frequently. Then we realize that we made a mistake, we go back, we fix it, and there becomes a greater sense of expertise. This is how we are building our understanding of becoming that expert. And we're going to become better at something over the long term. You can know something as a doctor, first year out of medical school, and when you're 35 years old, or you can know it when you're 45 years old, much better. You've practiced it, you've done it many times, and now you really know it. The expertise is sunk in. So you may know something along the continuum of expertise, as well as just getting to the point where you feel like you do know it. So I think it's really important that we just reflect and self-monitor in order to understand what we know.
All right. Thank you, Dr. VanDeventer. And we're going to, I guess, bring this home here. We are almost done. Couple things that we wanted to share with everybody. The first here are some cool resources that we found for using formative and summative assessments in the classroom. And these were top picks from commonsense.org. And I just wanted to give a very brief overview of each of these cool resources. First of all, they are all free for teachers. The first one is Kahoot. It is kahoot.com, which is a learning game creator. So a Kahoot is what they call it. It's its own learning space where teachers can create an interactive lesson, a quiz, a puzzle, a game. It has built-in question banks for a ton of different content. Teachers can host and play games where the class competes against each other and answers questions. Students can play from their cell phones. Teachers can add pictures or videos as something that the students would look at or read or listen to or watch, and then questions pop up and allow everybody to kind of play a puzzle or a game based on that content. So that's a really cool, fun, interactive way to use formative assessment. The second one is socrative.com. It is also free, and this allows you to develop quick questions to monitor learning and get immediate feedback. So teachers can be teaching something, stick a question up on the screen, the students answer it, and then the feedback immediately goes to the teacher so that they can monitor and know exactly where students are. Again, this can be used to create quizzes, class poll counts, can be used as an exit ticket. the best part is that for quizzes, it will automatically grade them for you, so less grading for teachers. It is free for all devices. So for example, during class, a teacher can pull up their dashboard from Summative and create in real time let's say, for example, a discussion. A state standard could be tagged to the discussion, and then students go in and answer the discussion question immediately. So it's like a live discussion board that a teacher can utilize. The last one is called Spiral. The website is spiral.ac. Again, this is a really cool free website or free app that can be used to create live collaborate sessions. So, or actually a teacher can also create a lesson that students go to later. But the cool part I found about this is that the live lessons can give quick fire assessments, team challenges. You could put up a video and turn it into a live chat along the side. So as students are watching a video, you can post discussions, and as the video is going, they can answer them directly with the rest of their class. So it's like a discussion board. Students can create group class presentations virtually. So student groups can present, and then the rest of the class can watch the presentations on the screen, and they can ask questions or interact live along the side as that group is presenting. So the spiral.ac is another very cool tech tool that can be used for formative assessments.
Let me just add, can I just say this, even though I think it's self-evident, all of these are either used online or as an app with students using a device in the classroom or in an online situation.
Yep. They can do it from their phone, from the computer.
Right.
So it's, yep. Okay, the next slide just kind of focuses on supporting our children and really being able to understand that assessment isn't something that is just going to happen in school. They're going to have to experience it, unfortunately, throughout their whole lives. So the way we teach them now to handle assessment pressure, to monitor themselves, to reflect, and to be excited about growing is going to impact the way that they react in the future when they run into assessments. So think about your child's going to college or getting their GED. They're going to have tests. They're going to have a lot of pressures of getting, the grades and the projects and passing those tests. When they get into their job, think about performance reviews from employers. Sometimes they're observations, sometimes it's written feedback that you're getting on your performance, but you have to be able to take that assessment and that pressure and reflect and come up with a plan to continue growing. Continuous job training. So right now, for example, this webinar is used for teaching something new. So being able to take trainings and things like that and to understand how to apply them and to change your thinking, something, again, our children are going to run into as they move on through their jobs. And then even in your personal lives, if you have a bad relationship or you're struggling with something, money or all of those issues we run into as adults, maybe raising your children, that takes true self-assessment and reflection to improve and change. And there may not be a summative assessment at the end of it, but there for sure is an end result that you're looking to achieve. So teaching our children to do this now and to handle these pressures without too much anxiety is very important to do. And I'm going to let Dr. VanDeventer kind of wrap us up here with our summary and closing out.
The key to this presentation is that it's important that we start to learn not to be afraid of assessment. And it's really a matter of just seeing how we've progressed. We talked about the many forms assessment can take, and that really it's trying to figure out where we are along the path to learning and to be prepared for those formal assessments when they come. When we make mistakes, we can learn from those mistakes and continue to work. And if we stop and reflect and think about whether we've learned the material, then we typically are going to know if we've done so. We haven't asked our children to do that a lot. They've been passive receptacles of learning that we've then tested for the last 100 years, and we're really moving away from that model. And it's important that we stop and think about ourselves, our children, and ourselves, whether we've learned. It's not good enough to just get a good grade in a course. We need to know that we left that course with understanding the content. Why are we spending our time there if we're not also understanding the content? That's very important in life, as all of us know that as adults in our jobs. And so we can pass that on to our kids and help them to think about, reflect, self-monitor, and know when they've learned something and ask for help when they need it. So
Dr. VanDeventer, along the line of that, Marty, one of our panelists or one of our participants had a question. If you have a child that just wants to be done with something because it's too hard for them, and they insist that they know it, they don't need to do it, how do you handle that more reflective piece when it comes to just their attitude about it's too hard and I'm not going to do it, I just want to get it done?
That's a great question. It stems back to motivation, and I really do think that one of the ways to approach that is probably to be able to sit down with them and say, well, let's see if you really do know this, and let's show me what you know about this. Let's talk more about this. How do we know that we know this? And let them tell you what they know, and perhaps try to explain the importance of learning this and see where they might have some breakdowns in understanding it, and try to encourage them to learn that along the way. I understand that it's very easy, especially in today's world, to become frustrated with learning and not want to engage in the type of learning. So it could also involve giving them opportunities to learn it in a new way. If we see that they really don't know the material, then maybe they just haven't had the right option for learning it. Maybe they need another method of learning that's more interesting to them. So really, I think it boils down to us figuring out a way to motivate them and engage them more. What do you think, Dr. Robertson?
Yeah, I think it's a mix of a little bit of trickery. A lot of children do like that aspect of prove it, or a little bit of competition. So maybe being playful with that aspect of learning, then walk me through it, explain to me what this is. And then when you notice they hit the hiccup or start getting frustrated, pulling in maybe a different style of instruction. Let's do this more visually if it wasn't done visually, or let's play a game with this if maybe it wasn't something more tactile. So I think that that's a great suggestion.
That was a great question, by the way. And I think it's probably the type of question that we encounter a lot, because students do feel sometimes that they're not interested in something and they just want to get it over with. They want to move on, and they are inclined to say that they know it when perhaps they don't. And so I think we have to start early with it, with letting them know that it's important to understand and to self-monitor. If we can get them doing that from the earliest years, reflecting and thinking about what they know, then that could be really helpful to get them to do it for their whole lives. Are there any other questions?